Déclaration.
Statements by ministers.
Je reconnais le...
I recognize the Right Honourable Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Today I rise to speak about the conflict in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. Over a week ago, Canadians awoke to horrifying images coming out of Israel after the terrorist organization Hamas launched an attack of unspeakable brutality. J'aimerais faire le point sur les mesures que prend...
I want to provide an update on the measures our government is taking to help and protect Canadians affected. I also want to share the real concerns that the situation is causing amongst our people in this country, among Jewish and Muslim Canadians, Canadians of Arabic origins, and all Canadians.
Parmi les milliers de...
Mr. Speaker, among the thousands of people affected by this violence, 5 Canadians were murdered by Hamas terrorists. 3 Canadians are reported missing and may be hostages. I know that all parliamentarians and Canadians' thoughts are with them and their loved ones. Canada asks Hamas to free all the hostages immediately.
Canadian Armed Forces flights have departed Tel Aviv so far with approximately 1,300 passengers on board. In addition, the first bus has departed the West Bank and brought Canadians to safety in Jordan. Le ministre des Affaires mondiales et
the Minister of Global Affairs and our ambassadors in the region are working tirelessly in order to help them. They're working tirelessly to come into contact with the Canadians that are affected and to help them. We're working with our partners to help Gaza leave the Gaza Strip and Israel the safest way possible, as well as the fastest way possible.
Deeply concerned by the dire and worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Canada is calling for unimpeded humanitarian access and a humanitarian corridor so that essential aid like food, fuel, and water can be delivered to civilians in Gaza. It is imperative that this happen. Depuis la fin de semaine dernière,
since last weekend, I have communicated with leaders in the region, such as the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, King Abdullah of Jordan, the President of the United Arab Emirates, and the President of Egypt, and the Emir of Qatar. I discussed freeing Canadian hostages and all hostages, of providing humanitarian assistance, and providing assistance to Canadians so that they are brought to safety, as well as for maintaining peace and stability in the region. Minister Jolie was on the ground. She's directing our diplomatic efforts, working day and night, meeting Israelis, Palestinians, and other partners in the region.
Is working tirelessly to ensure that CAF evacuation flights are getting as many Canadians out of the region as possible. And Minister Hussein is leading conversations with his international counterparts with
I apologize to interrupt the Right Honourable Prime Minister, but of course to remember that we are to refer to members by their titles, either titles as positions that they hold or as members of Parliament, but not by their names.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of National Defence is working tirelessly to ensure that CAF evacuation flights are getting as many Canadians out of the region as possible, and the Minister of International Development is leading conversations with his international counterparts and with aid organizations, making sure essential support is getting to affected people. Canada has committed an initial $10 million in humanitarian assistance to provide essentials like food, water, emergency medical aid, and protection assistance to those affected by the crisis in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. And I want to be clear, none of this aid is going to Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization that slaughtered and brutalized innocent people. Hamas continues to commit unspeakable atrocities and are trying to instigate further acts of violence against Jewish people. Let me be clear about Hamas. They are not freedom fighters. They are not a resistance. They are terrorists. Terrorism is always indefensible, and nothing can justify Hamas's acts of terror and the killing, maiming, and abduction of civilians. But let me also be extremely clear that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people, nor their legitimate aspirations. They do not speak for Muslim or Arab communities. They do not represent the better future that Palestinians and their children deserve. The only thing they stand for is more suffering for Israeli and Palestinian civilians. Canada fully supports Israel's right to defend itself in accordance with international law. And in Gaza, as elsewhere, international law, including humanitarian law, must be upheld by all. Even wars have rules. Canada is always steadfast in our commitment to the rule of law. The rule of law is what we stand up for here in Parliament, what we advocate through diplomacy, and what we will always fight for, no matter the circumstance. Ici, au pays, les émotions.
Here in our country, emotions are running extremely high. It can be explained in part by the fact that many of these stories are Canadian stories. That's due to our diversity. Many of us know someone who's been affected, or we know someone who knows someone. I met members of the Jewish community grieving in the aftermath of this tragedy. I was told about young people who were shot down during a music festival. The murder and kidnapping of older people, of women, of children. Members of the Jewish community talked to us about friends who died too soon and their fears of seeing their loved ones taken hostage.
From the Muslim and Palestinian community. They told me about how families in Gaza are spreading themselves between homes to prevent the possibility that they could all be lost in a single moment. That from Canada, they worry desperately about their loved ones, but because electricity has been cut off, they have to rely on sporadic 15-second phone calls to know who is safe. Their worries aren't just for people overseas. The worries are about people here at home, too. Across our country, both Jewish parents and Muslim parents wonder whether their kids are safe at school. Families are worried about going to places of worship. Jewish people are wondering if they shouldn't wear their Star of David or kippah in public. Muslim and Arab people are worried about being thought of as terrorists once again. The list of worries is endless. And the fear is real. There are rising instances of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We saw the reports of hate crimes against a Muslim woman in Montreal and at a Hebrew school in Toronto. And all of our hearts break at the horrifying news that came out of Illinois yesterday. There are so many people in Canada who are afraid of the escalating tension here at home, who are scared as they watch horrible things happen to people in places that they love in the Middle East, who for years have lived somewhere between fear and hope. Fear that escalation will tear them further apart, and hope that one day peace could finally take root. Il ne faut jamais oublier que la diversité.
Never forget that diversity is our strength. Canada welcomes people from all horizons who have a plethora of identities. We are a country of neighbors. of colleagues, of friends, of family. We represent that diversity and we live it every day. Now, more than ever, we have to unite. We have to avoid letting worries and suspicion separate us.
It's a short path from mistrusting your neighbor to entrenching division. A peaceful society does not happen by accident and won't continue without effort. We live in a country that upholds the freedom of expression, including religious and cultural expression, and every Canadian should feel safe doing so. This is the right and freedom every Canadian has under our Charter. Canadian liberty is not about taking away the freedoms of others, but living in a way that expands and strengthens freedom for everyone. Monsieur le Président, comme Canadiens,
Mr. Speaker, as Canadians, we've proven that it's possible to build and define a country based on, anchored in, common values.
ne se définit
Canada is not defined by one single identity, whether it be historical or ethnic or religious or anything else, but through shared values.
once again at a moment where our shared values are being put to the test. Unrest is being felt in ways big and small. Canadians are deeply worried, no matter their background. This is why we must hold on to our commitment to the idea of this country. We've been tested before about who we are and what we are. But the core values of Canada have always been there to guide us, to make us stronger, to bring us together when forces or events try to divide us. Our diversity is our strength. We can never forget this. This is a time to reach out, to support one another. Ask a friend, a family member, or a colleague how they're doing. Reach out to members of a different faith. Offer to listen. Offer to help where you can. People are not all right. So let's make sure they're not alone. As I've said before, the Canadian idea of liberty is an inclusive freedom, expansive freedom. Let's remember who we are as Canadians and what we stand for here and around the world. Respect for everyone's rights and freedoms and the rule of law. Respect for different languages, ethnicities, and religions. Respect for human life. And respect for each other. Thank you.
I'd like to recognize the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
October 7th, Hamas carried out the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. They deliberately targeted innocent mothers, babies, grandparents, partygoers, peace activists, and countless others who had no connection whatsoever, even to military life. These were innocent civilians living their lives until they suddenly came to an end. The attacks unleashed a carnage that is almost unprecedented in human history. In fact, what was special about these attacks is the delight and the triumphal pride and exhibitionism with which Hamas surely carried them out. All of that reminds us that Hamas is not a militant organization. It is not a government. It is not an activist group. Hamas is a sadistic, criminal, terrorist death cult, and it must be defeated. Indeed, Israel does have the right to defend itself in accordance with international law, and it has the right to respond, just as Canadians would respond if an attack of this type were carried out against our people or on our soil. There will be and there can be no negotiating with Hamas. Hamas can only be destroyed, just like President Obama destroyed and assassinated Osama bin Laden. There was no negotiating with bin Laden, and there can be no negotiating with Hamas. And this attack was also an attack on Canadians. If I could quote my deputy leader, in the carnage, 5 Canadians were murdered, and they're not just numbers. Alexander Luke from Montreal, Ben Mizrachiov of Vancouver, both murdered when Hamas opened fire on a music festival. Shir Gregory was also killed. Adi Vital Kaplun of Ottawa was murdered in her kibbutz, and Neda Epstein was murdered as he attempted to defend his girlfriend against a grenade. They are now in our memories forever, and may their memories be a blessing. Canadian citizens missing are believed to be held hostage among the 199 by Hamas who hold their people, their own people, under siege in their gruesome grip, serving as a proxy for the regime in Iran, imposing maximum terror on everyone in their path of destruction. Among the missing believed to be held, Vivian Silver, Judith Weinstein, Tiferet Lapidot, daughter of Canadian citizens. Their fate is unknown, and Canada can and must do more to achieve their liberation, and we pray for their fate and their safe return." End quote. Meanwhile, 1 million Gazans are reportedly displaced. Many more are suffering and have lost their lives. Let it be said that the suffering of the Palestinian people is a tragedy. Every innocent human life, Palestinian or Israeli, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or otherwise, is of equal precious value. All of us must do everything in our power to preserve this precious life and minimize the suffering of innocent civilians. Let us be clear, though, this is not incidental to Hamas's actions. It was the purpose of Hamas's actions. Hamas not only seeks the maximum suffering of the Israeli people, it seeks the maximum suffering of Palestinians as well. Hamas has controlled Gaza ever since Israel departed from the Gaza Strip roughly a decade and a half ago. And it has worked diligently to preserve Palestinian suffering and prevent any opportunity for an easing of tensions or a future of peace. And we know why Hamas felt the need to act with such drastic cruelty at this time. Hamas, of course, is guided by its terror sponsor, the dictatorship in Tehran, which had been growing in its concern for Israel's signature of the Abraham Accords with the UAE, with Bahrain, an agreement with Sudan, and even the possibility of normalization with Saudi Arabia. This kind of peace between Muslims and Jews, between Israelis and Arabs, would be a nightmare for both Hamas and for the dictatorship in Iran, who seek to perpetuate the conflict and the divisions as a source of power. They need to perpetuate the hatred in order to justify their dictatorships. And that's why they felt the need to interrupt any path towards peace. We all believe in a peaceful future that includes an independent Palestinian state, a two-state solution. And we believe that Israelis and Palestinians and other Arab countries need to discuss that peace. And we understand that stability and security for the Israeli people is necessary for that to happen. There are concrete actions that Canada can take towards these goals. And I will list some of them, though they are not exhaustive, and I expect that my members will be raising more of them later tonight in the Take Note debate. First, Canada must criminalize the IRGC, the terrorist arm of the Iranian government. There is no doubt that these attacks carried out on October 7th had a degree of sophistication and coordination to them that would not have been possible without aid from an outside government actor. And that actor, of course, was the dictatorship in Tehran. That same regime uses the IRGC as one of the most sophisticated and far-reaching terrorist groups in the world. It coordinates between Tehran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. It is unthinkable that the IRGC can operate legally in Canada. It can raise funds. It can prepare logistics. It can recruit new followers. Some of the people attached to the highest levels of the IRGC live in Canada today. Their very presence terrorizing peaceful Canadians of Iranian descent who desperately want to kick these terrorists out of our country. And they are right. The terrorists must be kicked out, and this organization must be a criminal entity in Canada. Second, we call for Hamas to immediately release all hostages. Third, we want a complete review of all aid programs to make sure that not one penny goes to terrorism. Fourth, we need to protect places of worship of all different backgrounds. We know that synagogues, potentially mosques, and other places of worship, we already know that these places have been targeted in the past in Canada. Prior to this recent incident, we know that Muslims have been the victims of hateful and murderous attacks by monsters here on our own soil. We know that synagogues are now facing attacks by anti-Semites. We know that churches have in the past been burnt down. All of this to say that we need to protect all of our places of worship. We need to debureaucratize and simplify the federal programs that provide security infrastructure at places of worship so that every single Canadian, regardless of their belief, can feel safe when they go to worship with their fellow Canadians. As I said at the outset, and as I say again, the lives of innocent Palestinians and Israelis are of equal value. And to that end, we believe that it is urgently important to minimize the suffering and protect the lives of Palestinians who had no part in these attacks. And that includes by supporting safe zones for civilians in Gaza, by backing a humanitarian corridor for food, water, and medical supplies. It means that we should support the evacuation of foreign nationals through Egypt. And it means that we must do a comprehensive review of all of the aid we are sending to Gaza to make sure that it actually reaches the Palestinian people and not the terrorist thugs in Hamas. Mr. Speaker, years ago when a terrorist attack happened in the United States of America, one commentator said that, almost trying to absolve the attack, said that we needed to look at the root causes of terrorism. Well, the root cause of terrorism is the terrorist, which I said at the time to the great horror of my critics. Some of them said that the statement was too simplistic to be true. Others said that it was that the statement was so obvious that it needn't be said at all. But in reality, it is neither. It is both simple and true, and it is perfectly the summary of the liberal democratic worldview. Our view is that each individual is responsible for their own actions. The root cause of terrorism, therefore, is not Islam or Christianity or Judaism or any religion. It is the individuals who carry out the terrorism. And this is important because it means that when we see vile actions carried out by people purporting to act on behalf of a religion, we do not blame all of their supposed co-religionists. Right. We do not blame Muslims for the actions of Hamas. We do not target our fellow Canadians because of something that has happened on the other side of the world. Here in Canada, we judge people on their own merits, their own deeds, and their own words. That is why the great Canadian Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier said when he was asked what is our nationality, he did not list an ethnicity or a religion or any other superficial demarcation. Back then, we were already mixed up. We had obviously Indigenous people, Scots, Irish, and many people from all around the world in our country. And therefore, we could not define ourselves on any of those lines. So he said, Canada is free and freedom is its nationality. And so it is today. And so let us then set out to protect the freedom of all Canadians and to stand for the values of freedom all around the world. Let us support our Jewish and Muslim friends here in this country as they watch with horror and with sadness at what is happening to loved ones on the other side of the world. They too are Canadians. They are our people. We must stand with them now and always, because after all, we are Canadians. Thank you.
I'd like to recognize the honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, on my own behalf and on behalf of the Bloc Québécois, I'd like to extend our condolences to Quebecers and Canadians who lost loved ones in the attacks, the terrorist attacks committed by Hamas in Israel. I'd also like to extend our condolences to all Israelis who are going through a very dramatic situation, as well as all Gazans, innocent civilians who are suffering similar atrocities. The only goal we have here must be humane and humanitarian. We need to be compassionate and understanding. We have to put ourselves in another's shoes and try to imagine if it were us, if this was happening here, if this was happening to our loved ones. The goal has to be recognition of the right to safety and security that all individuals should have. Mr. Speaker, in the past, many of us here, including in the Bloc Québécois, we have at times been critical of Israel. But in spite of that, we watched in disbelief at first as the horrific violence of the Hamas attacks became clear. And we condemned it for what it is, terrorism. Imagine for a second if we were Belgian and there were an attack that was claimed by a terrorist claiming to be acting on behalf of Islam, and imagine that that person had killed 2 people in the last couple of hours. That attack was probably motivated by the hateful speech, the hate speech and incitements to violence expressed not just by Hamas leaders, but those were repeated in streets and cities and capitals of major Western countries. We have to ask ourselves, Mr. Speaker, if our answer to this hate propaganda and encouragements to violence, is our response adequate? Have we taken adequate steps to confront this current threat? Mr. Speaker, Israel was not going to sit on its hands and remain exposed to such a threat. Israel could not rely on the Palestinian Authority to restore order. Hamas has to be uprooted if there's to be any hope of lasting peace in the region. So the Israeli military will enter the Gaza Strip. And I'd like to think that the gathering of Israeli troops on the borders of Gaza, as we wait currently to see what will happen next, I certainly hope that the purpose is to allow for the arrival of humanitarian assistance that Gazans, that Palestinian civilians are waiting for and that they need. They do need that help. And we hope that the path towards relative security in Egypt will be opened, that a corridor will be opened in the hours to come. Like the other leaders, I'd like to point out how important it is to draw a clear distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian civilians they claim to represent. A Palestinian family and a Quebec family, we're all the same. Hamas has revealed the full darkness of their purpose. They do not want peace for Palestinian civilians. They want war for everyone. And Tehran is all smiles. Hatred is a deep-seated evil that grows and feeds on a sometimes twisted reading of history. In Quebec and in Canada, we condemn this hate. Similarly, Canada must not remain on the sidelines of major movements like this. We should be at the table with our allies in searching for coordinated solutions, a Western response to bring these hostilities to a quick end and to wrestle Hamas to the ground. We talked about 5 countries, the U.S., who took the initiative, the U.K., France, Italy, and Germany. If we were working with them, Canada could probably better improve the effectiveness of the concerted evacuation of Quebecers and Canadians from Israel. Canada would probably be better able to improve the chances of freeing Canadian hostages. Canada can be more effective if it adds its voice to the demands of the U.S., Europe, and the UN for immediate humanitarian intervention. I would also call on the Prime Minister once again, at an appropriate time for all party leaders, for us to be privately briefed in full confidentiality on developments in this crisis, which is affecting so many of our constituents. In the interval, which we hope will be a short one, our hearts go out with all our heart and with all our compassion, and sometimes even with our tears. We stand with the victims of this unprecedented violence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, New Democrats are devastated by the brutal massacre and terrorist attack by Hamas, who on October 7th killed over 1,300 Israeli civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Among those victims were Canadians, members of our communities. The accounts of what was done to Israelis in this attack, including what was done to children, horrifies every one of us. We condemn Hamas and these terrorist attacks that have caused so much pain for the Jewish community globally and in Canada. And this begs the question of what Canada has done in the past few years to stop arms going into the hands of Hamas. Hamas actions constitute heinous violations of international law and international crimes for which they must be held accountable. I want to express my profound sadness and anger at rising anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian racism that we are seeing globally, including in Canada. Rising anti-Semitism is causing Canadian Jews to keep their children from school. Mr. Speaker, rising anti-Palestinian racism took the life of a 6-year-old in Chicago yesterday. Canadians from both of these communities are distraught, and I think that the federal government could do more to increase the security across places of worship, something many communities have called for years. Mr. Speaker, we are in a very dark time, and I am urging all members of this House to take care to understand how deeply communities are hurting. I grieve with Canadians who have lost loved ones and who are afraid for their families. I stand with the families of hostages and call for their immediate release. And as this crisis worsens, I also want us to pay attention to the unfolding humanitarian nightmare in Gaza. I want to state clearly that international law obligations are not reciprocal. One war crime does not excuse another. Retribution is not justice. Retribution does not bring peace. And I want members of this House to know that international law was not written by pacifists. The laws of war were written by governments whose militaries had suffered extraordinary losses, who had seen civilians massacred, who had experienced the horrors of war. International law, which Canada has promised to uphold, sets limits on military actions, state and non-state. What those countries can do in war. It seeks to protect civilians, all civilians. David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee, said yesterday, international humanitarian law is the way that previous generations have learned to mitigate the worst of war. It is a very low bar, but this low bar applies to everyone. And we are unfortunately watching violations of international law in Gaza. A siege with no water, no electricity, no food, entire communities destroyed, entire families wiped out. Over 1,000 children have been killed. Hospitals have been bombed and workers killed, humanitarian aid workers killed. United Nations independent experts have said this amounts to collective punishment. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, has said a full blockade of Gaza could be considered a crime against humanity and a genocide. This morning, Defense for Children International confirmed that more than 1,030 children in Gaza have been killed by Israeli forces since October 7th. That is one child, Mr. Speaker, every 16 minutes. That is one child every 16 minutes. And now we are reading reports that Hamas is stealing what little humanitarian aid is available for civilians. Let's be clear. Hamas is making already vulnerable Palestinians suffer further in the siege. Palestinians have been suffering from Hamas brutality, as well as the absence of real democratic Palestinian leadership. And with the dangerous influence of external states like Iran, this has made things very, very much worse. But it does not absolve Israel of its obligations to protect civilians, nor does it absolve Canada of its obligations to call out violations to international law when they occur. United Nations Relief Chief Martin Griffin said yesterday, the past week has been a test for humanity, and humanity has failed. The forcible transfer of 1 million people from their homes is not an evacuation, it is illegal. Babies in incubators unable to be relocated. Medical staff refusing to abandon these babies, knowing that they may die in the coming days. Gazans are afraid to be pushed into Egypt because they do not know if they will be allowed back. This is a humanitarian and political disaster of enormous proportions, and Canada is silent. Where is the government in condemning this siege, this forcible transfer, this humanitarian crisis? The minister has spoken to her Israeli counterparts. The Prime Minister has spoken to the leader of Israel to convey Canada's support. But in any of those conversations, has Canada told Israeli officials that this scale of revenge, these clear violations of law, are unacceptable to Canadians? So many Israelis are speaking out against Israel's actions in Gaza. Survivors of the Hamas terrorist attack are asking for peace. They are saying, not in our name. They are asking for the release of hostages, including Canadians. Maoz Inon, whose parents were murdered by Hamas, said, and I quote, "I am not crying for my parents. I am crying for those who will lose their lives in this war. We must stop the war. We are not seeking revenge. Revenge will lead to more suffering and more tragedies." Yonatan, the son of Canadian hostage Vivian Silver, has said the following: "She would be mortified by the attack on Gaza because you can't cure killed babies with more dead babies. We need peace." Vivian Silver is a member of Women's Wage Peace. She has spent years working for peace and justice in Israel and Palestine. Yesterday, Women Wage Peace made the following comments: "We hear words of revenge. We hear all restraints have been removed. We'll wipe out Gaza. But one cannot resolve injustice with another injustice. We in this House need to be thinking of both the short-term humanitarian crisis and also the long term. New Democrats for decades have called for an end to the occupation and for a just peace for Israelis and Palestinians. This year has already been brutal for all in the region, before the terrorist attacks, before this new siege of Gaza. And now we are moments away from a broader war that could engulf the entire region. We are moments away from an alarming and long-term refugee crisis. We are further from peace, Mr. Speaker, than we have ever been. We speak of ending the occupation, but we are so far away from a political solution. And the Liberal government is failing to step up. It's failing to step up for international law, for Israelis, and for Palestinians. This is the moment to call for calm. We are witnessing an increase of attacks on Palestinians in Jerusalem and in the West Bank by settlers and Israeli security. We have seen reports of abuses of Israeli families who are demanding that the leadership of the Israeli government put the hostages first. People are divided. People are hurting. Mr. Speaker, the only solution is a political solution. There is no military solution to this conflict. I am begging the government to realize what that they say now matters. It matters so much, and they must call for a ceasefire. Canada must support international justice efforts by the ICJ and the ICC to investigate war crimes by all military actors in Palestine. All war crimes by all parties in this conflict must be prosecuted. Canada must call for a ceasefire and an end to the forcible transfer of civilians. And I want to end by thanking all Israeli and Palestinians working to preserve life: medical workers, humanitarians, human rights advocates, those calling for peace, ordinary people doing what they can in the face of such horror. They are the light in this darkness. We see you and we stand with you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I see the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands raising her hand. Would this be for a point of order to request consent of the House to reply to this statement?
From all different parties to condemn Hamas and to make very short statements.
No, she's not on mute. All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion to speak will please say nay. I'm afraid there is no consent.